And the basic idea is this. We looked at Walt Disney World, the legal framework that created the authority for Walt Disney World in Florida. It's called the Reedy Creek Improvement District. And what it did was it created an incredible degree of autonomy and regulatory policy in particular, land use, environmental to a large extent, a lot of water management type regulations. But it gave a lot of free market play to this autonomous district in what was an undeveloped, poor swampland in the 1950s and 60s when it was being acquired by Walt Disney World. And within literally 5 years of putting this framework into place, that land was transformed into literally the Magic Kingdom. And so what we said to ourselves is, what if we could take the degree of autonomy that Walt Disney World has? And the reason why that's significant is that you need reliability in any legal framework to draw massive new investment. And particularly if you're going to create a legal framework that is best practices well beyond what we normally see in government, things on a par with Hong Kong or Dubai or Liechtenstein or many other places around the world that we'll talk about in my presentation. So if you're going to take the state of the art in public policy, embed it in a place, you've got to guarantee it's going to last. And the model for that is Walt Disney World. It has been maintained now for decades and has drawn investment that you cannot imagine to a place that was completely backwater in a literal sense in almost no time. But we did not want to create a framework that was limited to Mr. Walt Disney. And so the challenge that you have is in accepting the open platform nature of this. This is an option. It's meant to be an option for any community that wants it, as long as you meet the thresholds we'll discuss. It's not meant to be unexpandable once it's created. It's meant to be able to expand to surrounding areas if people see it and like it and want to be part of it. It's not meant to be anybody's fiefdom or anyone's kingdom. So think of this as the opposite of what we typically see in local government, which is when you create a new framework for a special district, you add a layer of new regulations, new governance, people you never knew about before, now you're voting for them, right? This is the opposite of this. This is an option to have less government, to hit the reset button, to swipe out in one fell swoop as much of the existing regulatory framework that has existed for decades, often inexplicably, and instantly replace it with the best public policies that the think tank world has been fighting for and can't quite achieve at a statewide level, but might be able to achieve voluntarily at a community-based level, where sort of like a sandbox in a software development company, you can watch these policies play out and through their own success draw the kind of attention and expansion that is forced on no one, which ultimately will drive statewide policy and even federal policy, as we'll talk about. So again, think of this as a Disney World of capitalism idea. And if you don't like the word capitalism, call it freedom or free markets. But that's the idea. Create one option among the dozens of options that currently exist for municipalities and special districts where you're leapfrogging not to more government, but to the state-of-the-art and free market public policy. This is the vision. The vision is, if you look around the world, where you see big reforms happening, it's usually not nationwide all at once, it's not statewide all at once, it's usually municipal level. It's usually in city-states. It's usually in small locales. And I think that for a large part, a lot of the regulatory reform stuff that we do gets so incrementalized because we start at the statewide level and because we do things like preemption, where we bring a fight to everyone who might not want it. And so we should take a lesson from history and look at how West Berlin brought down the Soviet Union. And we should look at how Hong Kong changed China. And we should look at, thank you. Oh, great. And we should look at these examples and recognize that if you want great public policy that is not, corrupted through politics, it's not made into so much sausage, the way to do it is to start small and to start with places that want it. And as we've already discussed, the rural areas of our country, Oklahoma, other states, Arizona certainly, they're being left behind, even as we speak today. They don't seem to get the attention that everyone else does because they're out of the way, and we need to help them. We also have the problem, as we've talked about, of multiple layers of agencies. To be a small businessman, if you're not a lawyer or know a lawyer who works for next to nothing, is fraught with risk. You can trip so many different wires of so many different agencies that you can be placed out of business at any time. And then you have the problem of cronyism. What starts with Ralph Nader ends up being controlled by the very industry he railed against. It's just the nature of the beast. The industries that are affected by regulation eventually figure out ways to control the regulator. Why would they not? And they have more of an interest in doing so than just the average Joe, and there aren't enough Ralph Naders to keep things in line. And so the reality is that every regulatory scheme that begins with good intentions collapses under the weight of cronyism over time. So, what if we could bring everything we believe in together in one package as an option, only for communities that wanted it? Limited government, the best in free markets, and really maximizing what federalism is all about, the decentralization that Trent talked about, the local-driven policy decision idea that is what's supposed to be dominant in our form of government. So, again, the way to think about this is that this is a special district, sort of like Walt Disney World's Reedy Creek Improvement District, where embedded in the law are the best practices for free market type policy. And if you meet certain basic thresholds, namely, everyone affected by this choice agrees, unanimous consent of all property owners and all electors in the area. That's a high hurdle, yes, but for a dramatic change like this, you're going to want that kind of consensus. For the kind of sandbox you're creating, you're going to want total buy-in, right? But if you get 100% consent of all landowners, 100% consent of all electors, then you instantly leapfrog to this new regulatory environment, one that's inherently pro-business, pro-freedom, pro-property rights. Now, you can probably say, why is it in a compact? A compact is a fancy word for an agreement among states. Compacts do something no other state-type statute can do, and that is become federal law. If Oklahoma were to pass the enabling authority, this Prosperity States Compact legislation, and another state were to join in the compact, and both states form an agreement to maintain this authority and to recognize each other's districts, if Congress were to give its consent to this by a resolution, by an appropriation, by a tax credit, there's any number of ways Congress could consent to the compact. If Congress gives its consent to that framework, it is well-established U.S. Supreme Court precedent going back at least 120 years, and some say 200 years, that the compact becomes equivalent to federal law, even to the extent of trumping inconsistent federal laws. So that policy environment that you create for communities within this district could override conflicting federal laws. There is no other state-led, state-created mechanism to achieve targeted federal reform in this way. Now, we're getting late on this because with the booming developing in the economy, a lot of the money that was on the sidelines a couple of years ago when I first started talking about this is now coming off the sidelines. But the reality is, a couple of years ago, there was over $30 trillion in investment funds sitting on the sidelines looking for places to go because nothing looked profitable. That number may be cut in half today, but it's still there. And there's lots of places in rural areas that could draw this attention, the attention of a Dubai, which, by the way, only took 10 years to go from a camel 40,000 person desert town into the equivalent of Manhattan, right? Because they chose to adopt hardcore, purist for the area, free market common law type policies. Another example, people say, well, what can a small jurisdiction do? What difference does it make? And how do we know this really works? Well, this chart shows you how significant policies can be, even in small jurisdictions. The bottom line is the trend line of economic growth per capita in Cuba. Not much has changed since 1970, because not much has changed in policy since 1970. The middle line, and a little color impaired, it looks red to me. The middle line is Singapore. And in 1960, it was as poor as Cuba. But they did something different in 1970, and that is they started to adopt the Hong Kong model with a few unique twists of its own. And as you can see today, the blue line, which is the United States, is well overtaken by Singapore. If you look at the numbers, in just under 30 years it overtook us, or just over 30 years, Singapore overtook us after choosing Hong Kong-style free market policies in the main. Cuba remains the same. So policy decisions in small jurisdictions make a big difference. And, the argument that, well, Singapore was surrounded by water and had access to trade areas and all that, well, Cuba's much better positioned than Singapore was in 1970, right? In terms of access to markets, the location of something is only marginal in its importance. The policy environment is what makes the difference. One last analogy to look at. I've talked about how Hong Kong drove reform in China, and this is remarkable. Basically, Deng Xiaoping looked across the bay in 1980 and said, how is it that Hong Kong looks like this and we look like that? Because in 1950, there was no difference. The difference is that in 1952 or so, the British colony adopted Adam Smithian laissez-faire policies explicitly. And so Deng Xiaoping created a special economic zone status for a couple of cities in 1980 to model a lot of, not all of, but a lot of Hong Kong's policies. And those were so successful that then soon there were 8, and then there were 10, and then there were 20. And the untold story of China's success today is that most of the country now is on paper in a special economic zone with greater economic freedom than the average American state. They are more like Hong Kong than we are. Now, they happen to have a communist party, and that holds them back. But the reality is that there's a reason beyond the obvious that China has been so successful, and that is they've adopted the policies we've been abandoning. We did a study, or I should say the ASU State University did a study where they looked at all of these small jurisdictions that adopted deep free market reforms that were durable, reliable, shifting the curve, and they averaged 8% plus economic growth. Small jurisdictions, not large country areas, right? So, how do you form a district? If you're outside a city, it takes a petition of 100% landowners, 100% of electors. When you fill out the petition with a legal description and you're saying, I want to opt in, and you file that with the County Recorder of Deeds, then the district will be created. Essentially, instantly in that footprint, reforming state and local laws. If you're inside a city, nobody's forced into this. There is no preemption. There's just one more toolbox item. Should be very exciting to cities. It was in Arizona. We kept the neutrality of the municipal league in Arizona. You have to have a local law that first opts into the statewide framework, says we do want these districts to be formed, and it can be tailored to specific areas inside a municipality, places that are not doing well. And then once that local law is in place, then the same petition process can take place. If we get a second state into this compact and we get congressional consent, then the result of that will be all federal laws that are inconsistent with the policy environment inside these districts, and only where the districts are, mind you. You're not changing policies outside of the districts. You're only doing for the people who want it, in the places that want it. All federal laws that come into conflict with that policy environment are reformed. So you're probably going to say, what are those policies? The basic idea that we've embedded, and this is a very long piece of legislation, and it has to be, because you're untangling a lot of mess. To erase to reset the button, you've got to do it responsibly, and it takes some language. But the basic concept is that the only regulatory authority that exists, the fundamental touchstone of all regulatory authority in the district, are property rights, contractual freedom. Everything has to be tied back to that in a very rigorous way through a regulatory impact statement. Okay? Criminal laws are strictly limited to the extent that the district does do criminal law enforcement, and it doesn't have to only laws against violence, theft, fraud, evil intent crimes. There is no, it's a crime because we say so type crime that's permitted to the district. And for some flexibility, we do allow districts to adopt training wheels of any existing regulations that used to be in place in that zone for 5 years. But after 5 years, they have to do the same regulatory impact study to make sure they can relate any regulation to the protection of property rights and contractual freedom. And in all of that, the burden of proof remains on the district, not the property owner, not the person being regulated. So that's the core of the regulatory framework. The other thing is whatever regulations that the district does issue, they automatically sunset every 5 years. They immediately repeal, and they have to go through the process, the regulatory impact statement process again. Now, on the tax side, what we recommend is including a land covenant, very similar to a homeowner's assessment, if you're familiar with those, where you replace all existing taxation with just a simple contractual obligation of every landowner to pay the same amount of money over to the state, over to the county, and any other taxing authority that might have been displaced. So instead of worrying about how you tax, you just settle on the amount of money that needs to be paid and make it a contractual obligation that runs with the land. Now, you can use different formulas, and we can talk about that in question, but that's a pretty far-reaching topic. But the basic idea is let's stop the uncertainty over tax policy. Let's boil it down to its essence, which is a certain amount of money is demanded by certain agencies. Deliver that money, make it an enforceable obligation that's contractually binding that runs with the land. And it's really important here that we've done a number of things to make sure that we don't create sort of evil kingdoms. These districts are notable for the lack of power that they have. They only can do these regulatory best practices that are strictly subject to regulatory impact statements, review, and sunset. They can only do crimes of evil intent, violence, theft, or fraud. All municipal services, and this is where Byron's work comes in, must be competitively bid. Everybody has to agree if anyone's going to be subsidized. And no borrowing can exceed the net assets of the district. So if they can do borrowing, but as soon as they borrow up to the value of their assets, they're done. So they have to have assets to borrow. There's no free borrowing here. We've also made it very clear, on top of this, belt and suspenders wise, that they're subject to existing state and federal constitutional law. They have no inherent taxing authority. Everything is running either in that revenue covenant at the get-go or not. There's no eminent domain authority, no civil forfeiture authority, no subsidies, no anti-competitive regulation that's explicitly barred, and they cannot accept or give government grants of any kind. Then, to make things even more checked and balanced, we allow any property owner to revert to non-district status at will. By following a very similar petition procedure, they can get out within 30 days and revert back to the surrounding jurisdictions. And so districts can go beyond that and provide other methods of exit. So what you have is a dynamic process inside the district where you form the districts easily, but if they're not working out, you can get out easily. We've made it very clear that as long as problems are contained in the district, outside jurisdictions cannot touch them except for crimes of evil intent, violence, theft, and fraud. So outside law enforcement jurisdictions, if they see this turning into a den of mafia operations or something like that, they can go in there and they can shut it down, right? But other than that, if it stays in the district, outside jurisdictions cannot address it. But if it does leave the district, anything leaves the district, environmental spillover effects, anything needs legal process serving inside the district, criminal activity spillover effects, that is clearly going to trigger outside jurisdictions that have full authority to address the problem, even if they have to go inside the district. Now, some people are concerned about, well, what if people inside the district use outside governmental services? The legal framework also authorizes outside jurisdictions to charge a user fee for residents or businesses in a district to access their services. And so the bottom line is this: we've paid careful attention to free riding concerns or externality concerns. The language is far more robust than you want me to repeat in this context. You can read it in the legislation. the goal is that if it only stays in the district, then it's fine. If it leaves the district or impacts the outside world in any negative way, it can be addressed. Now that's the baseline, but I'm not so Pollyanna to think that you're going to leave it at the baseline. And I would love you to, because that's what our experts recommend, and that's the kind of dramatic change and reset button that some communities need. But we do allow for exemptions from these baseline concepts. And so one of the things to underscore in this compact is if you want to preserve anything in the current policy environment in these districts, despite its purpose of being a reset button, right, you can. We strongly resist certain ideas that we've encountered, and others we've accommodated. To give you some ideas where we think that the politics may be difficult to overcome, you might want to preserve your state securities laws or your state insurance laws. You might want to preserve your anti-discrimination laws, at least dealing with on issues of race, right? So there are a number of current laws that you can exempt and preserve inside these districts, and that's where the importance of the legislative process takes over. We've given you a reset button, only affecting those who want it. You can then add certain exemptions to that reset button, what will not be reset. But the one major point I want to emphasize here is you're not going to draw the massive new investment to rural areas if you don't create a dramatically new policy environment. And so you have to be very careful how much you will pull back into the district, because the more you do, the less impactful this will be. And particularly if other states catch on, and we had 7 states moving forward with the bill last year for the first time, which is not bad for a new idea, one of which was viral. Georgia filed it, and we didn't even know. There are going to be some states out there that aren't going to be exempting so much. And if they're in the same compact, then that means that you're going to be having businesses are going to be looking at their prosperity districts and operating in both, and they're probably going to shift a lot of their activities to the freer district. And that's by design. We want to have that competition among member states towards more freedom. But the bottom line is if you choose and you wish to, you can preserve any existing legal framework that currently exists in the district. And then, by the way, in that local law that allows districts to be formed inside cities, cities and towns can do a similar degree of exemptions. So, subject to the same concerns that we have. Last point, what's great about this being a compact is the Supreme Court has ruled that they will not interfere with compact enforcement, and they will defer to alternative dispute resolution in a compact rather than having to go through a court system. So if you're not a huge fan of going through court systems to resolve disputes, you can build into a compact an alternative dispute environment where courts will defer much more strongly than any place else. Now, for Arizona, that's a big concern, being in the Ninth Circuit. Maybe not so much in Oklahoma. But the best thing about a compact, as I indicated before, is if you get congressional consent, it transforms it to the equivalent of federal law. And its policy environment will override conflicting federal law. And so if you want to drive federal law reform targeted to the places that need it, leaving out the places that don't or that don't want it, this is the only vehicle that can do it. So let's think big again. Right now, a huge chunk of Florida's economy is due to one special district, characterized largely by regulatory autonomy in land use and development. Just land use and development, regulatory autonomy, right, did that. Imagine if you just cleaned the decks and instantly replaced everything with the Hong Kong model across the board and created a durable environment that businesses could rely on at least as long. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, we have a question.
Representative Ford. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nate, that's interesting, almost makes me dizzy to think of the possibilities. I've got 3 questions. and I'll just ask all three, and then you address them as one or as you see fit. In these prosperity districts, it almost, and I love your terms like untangling mess, which I assume means government. Yeah, which is a mess. How does a place like Disney World, when they're free of a lot of the restrictions and regulations, who regulates public safety? When they're building things, who's ensuring that the investors do not cut cost corners, and put the public at risk? The next question is, when you create these districts, how is that fair to small business owners around that area that still have to go into the tangled mess of government regulation? These don't, but small business owners do. And my third question is, have any of these districts been created and then were just a total failure?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Mr. Representative, excellent questions, all deserving of a response. First of all, a prosperity district has not yet been formed anywhere because the model legislation was developed about a couple of years ago. And so it hasn't failed. Now, everywhere that I know of that has tried deep, dramatic Hong Kong-style reforms internationally, and to the extent that we approach it nationally in places like Sandy Springs, have been a dramatic success. And so freedom works. It works almost all the time. And now that doesn't mean you don't have any regulation, right? The critical thing that you'll see in the legislation is how carefully we've crafted the regulatory principles so that they are designed to allow for regulation that is not anti-competitive, that cannot be captured, that cannot be there for fluffy, unproven reasons, right? It is a rigorous regulatory impact process where the regulation is tested every 5 years to see if it's really after public health and safety. And if it's not, it doesn't get promulgated, or it gets self-repealed every 5 years and can't get reinstated. And the burden is kept on the regulator all the time. So this is the answer to your question about public safety. Again, there is going to be regulation in these districts. The regulations can be strictly limited to those that actually advance public health and safety in a provable way. And they're going to be revisited every 5 years before they're reinstated and assessed for whether they're actually producing results. So now, of course, you're going to say, why reinvent the wheel? Well, the problem is most of the regulation we have in place is not driven by a similarly rigorous process. It's driven by politics. And very often, if you're not in the industry, you can't see why a particular regulation is actually illegitimate, even as a legislator familiar with the general field, right? So what we're saying is that rather than getting in the trap that we've seen most legislatures do forever now, trying to do regulatory reform across the board in a tangled mess, let's try it by just sweeping aside that mess. Not everywhere, not for anyone who doesn't want it, but only for those who do want it, and not just the landowners, also the people who vote there. And yes, that may be a very small place, a very sparsely populated place, but what better place to have that experiment where you can see what will develop if we sweep the deck clean of the current set of regulations and instantly leapfrog. And then finally, the market is actually the ultimate guarantor of safety in our system through a variety of mechanisms: insurance, through banking, and through the customer. Now, oftentimes, particularly in land sales, it's hard for the customer to see all the safety issues as well as someone earlier could see it, because you've got walls put over things, and it's hard to, even for a home inspector, to get in there and know what's going on. But every lender is holding major developers to various standards. The developers, in getting their insurance, are being held to various standards. It is standard in a development industry to confront an insurance underwriter that's going to say, you need to build a code. And so what will happen in these districts, as happens in most places, is that regardless of what the local regulation is, and there may not be any particular regulation in a certain area, insurance companies if they see valuable regulations, they're going to put it into their contract, which will still be effective in the district, and they're going to say, you need to build to this code, or else we're not going to provide insurance. And so you're going to see markets at the level of insurance, at the level of lenders protecting their interest. I mean, what lender is going to want to lend to a giant development over time that's going to create a disaster, right? They're going to lose their investment. At the very least, they might get sucked in by a creative plaintiff's attorney into somehow being equally responsible at the same time, too. So there are tremendous market forces at play beyond the consumer himself and his home inspector that keeps the process honest in the main, right? And then you're left with the criminals, right? Essentially the fraudsters and the other folks that are essentially the equivalent of anyone who hit your grandmother over the head, only maybe wearing a suit, right? And in those contexts, that's where the district still has the regulatory authority, clearly, and in ways that are designed carefully to avoid abuse. I hope that answers your question.
Do you recognize?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I was envisioning something almost to the concept of the fox guarding the hen house type thing. But your concept is really free market based, where regulations are built into the investment. That's who is overseeing the quality control.
And if I may further respond, Disney World actually, when it got its regulatory autonomy, it was held to statewide minimum standards as a floor in the enabling authority. It didn't define that. Believe it or not, that's how the statute just says, statewide minimum standards. And at the time, Florida really didn't have any. Well, Florida, I mean, Disney World ended up contractually adopting some of the highest building code standards in existence anywhere in the country voluntarily in order to draw the investment that they needed to scale up this swamp to in 5 to 10 years. So I mean, whether you say it was their goodwill or because they had no choice but to do it to get the money, that's what happened in Disney World. And to this day, the building code standards and safety codes in place in Disney World, except for the alligators in the pond, I think. But the building code standards there are far in advance of any other surrounding area, and they're used as a leader for many of the other places. My opinion is that maybe they even go overboard. But the tendency to protect investments, particularly with large-scale investments, is to be fairly cautious in the development of safety standards, and those are done contractually.
Representative Moore. So how big does the area have to be? Is there a minimum requirement for how many square miles or whatever that this has to be?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, our recommendation is 1 square mile as a minimum. Why? That's the size of Monaco, roughly the size of the major development in areas that sprung up in Singapore and in Hong Kong. And if you look around the world at the many jurisdictions that actually made a big difference, it's hard to see how much smaller you can go than a square mile, because you have to have a certain critical mass of space to do things and to draw ideas about what industries can go and what things can happen. On the other hand, using that tailoring feature, the sort of state exemption feature, you could make it smaller or bigger. We say keep it the entire state open to it, but if there's parts of the state you want to focus this in, maybe even a staged way, or maybe forever, you can say we're only allowing prosperity districts in the southwest corner of Oklahoma where we have income levels below X. So we recommend 1 square mile. It seems to be the critical mass of land you need for significant things to happen. But it is up to your statewide tailoring if you think it should be smaller, bigger, statewide, or focused. And then at the local level, if municipalities want to opt in, their local law can further shrink or tailor. They could make it a specific warehouse district that's never gone anywhere. Or they could make it, if they wanted to, a specific building. Or if you wanted, see, one of the things to step back and think about this is essentially a reset button on regulations. You can use these prosperity districts for more than just building industry. You could build roads with them. right? I mean, so you might say, well, we don't need a square mile or even a square mile of land. We just need a road from here to there, and we can't deal with this tangled mess of regulations in this context, and we want to just get it built fast. Let's slap a prosperity district down. You know, it might be a spaghetti line with not much square acreage or mileage, but that could be your prosperity district, and it could have just that purpose.
Follow-up?
For a follow-up.
So this could be a road or city street, a municipality or a part of a municipality like at 23rd Street or the city of Spencer or something like that. And then what does this do to property values typically? What would you anticipate that creating a free market district or prosperity district would do to property values in that area?
They'll boom. There's no question the value would immensely increase because the use capacity of the land immensely increases. The wealth creation capacity of the land vastly increases. We have a forthcoming study where we recommend that, you remember we talked about replacing the tax burden with just a straight payment and maybe basing that on a formula of some kind. We recommend, based on our research, having a formula tied to land value so that if you start with land that at a raw, undeveloped state was worth very little and it turns into Hong Kong, you'll create literally a geyser of revenue off of that land, and it will be no skin off the nose of the folks who are there because A, they created it completely voluntarily, presumably foresaw this potential, and will have been ready for it. Meanwhile, it would operate for the state something like the oil fields in Alaska operate for the budget in Alaska. It would just be a geyser of revenue because of the land value enhancement. And look, you don't have to look any further than Singapore or Hong Kong to see that. I mean, those were basically rocks in the ocean. And then all they did was basically say, here, have more freedom.
A couple of questions from the chair, and then we'll go to Representative Watson. First of all, thank you to each of you for being here. We really appreciate your presence today. Mr. Dranias, we live in a highly regulated society. I think all of us in here would agree to that statement. And when you transition, could you speak to the question of if there was a transition to a much lower regulated, at least area, what are some of the unforeseen consequences that could possibly come from that? Thomas Jefferson said it is the natural course of events that liberty recedes and government grows. We are still taking, with the idea of a prosperity district, we're still taking the idea of a larger government making a smaller government. However, if the natural tendency of government is to grow, not recede, what unintended consequences could come from a society going from a highly regulated atmosphere to a lower regulated atmosphere overnight?
Well, I mean, it would be unfair of me and biased, obviously, for me to say that we've controlled for all the unintended consequences in the design of this legislation. But honestly, all of those that we could conceive of, we either controlled for or created mechanisms to control them. The most important mechanism to control unintended consequences is the ease of withdrawal, whereby property owners can revert back to the original jurisdiction following a similar petition process. And then at the front end, remember, this is 100% consent driven, 100% consent of electors, 100% consent of the property owners. And then the other thing that we've done, again, is any externality problem, anything that leaves the district in any way adversely affecting the outside jurisdictions, triggers a right of reach into the district. And frankly, we may have made that too robust. It may actually be abused by outside jurisdictions. If you look for an unintended consequence, it may be that we, in trying to address some of the unintended consequences, we created unintended consequences of diminishing the autonomy of the district. But from my perspective, that was worth the trade-off because the way that I foresee these districts starting are very similar to Walt Disney World. It probably will be in the middle of nowhere. It'll probably be in a place where nobody has any other plans for anything else. It's completely lost. There's no hope, right? And everyone around it is going to be rooting for the foreseeable future for its success. And so the problem of sort of outsiders crossing over and interfering with the autonomy of the district, I think is going to be minimal. at least in the initial phases. And then I think the success will do what we saw happen in communist China. I mean, communist China was not fertile ground for Hong Kong to take hold, right? But the success, the human success, is what propagated the concept of the special economic zone. And I can't imagine we're going to, our state or your state or any state is going to be adverse to seeing the flourishing and the prosperity that results in this district and will want to interfere with it. But bottom line is this: externalities are controlled. Exit is as easy as entrance. Entrance is a high hurdle requiring total consent. The sunsetting of any regulation that the district does, the automatic sunsetting, I mean, not just a review process, it is self-repealed every 5 years, means if you got any crazy regulations coming out of the district, it's going away every 5 years. We've preserved judicial authority. We've preserved the Constitution. So if there's anything going on in a district that's potentially unconstitutional, again, at risk of the autonomy of the district, there is a degree to which the courts will get involved to oversee that. So we've taken the lessons of the founders, and that is creating divisions of power, checks and balances, decentralizations, exit possibilities, all of which will work to keep unintended consequences to a minimum, far less, if I may, than the current system of unintended consequences that attend any new district that adds new government, which is what most of the dozens of new districts do, and frankly, the unintended consequences of even creating a new city, which has vastly more power to do vastly more things of damage because they have no limit on their taxing authority, no limit on their eminent domain authority, no limit on their regulatory authority. So if you have the world of unintended consequences as it currently exists under the status quo versus the world of unintended consequences in a district, our world of unintended consequences is very, very small.
So you mentioned the 100% buy-in that must be attained. First, I've been in this position for 8 years, and I don't know that I've ever seen a single issue that has had 100% buy-in from anybody. We can't agree on what temperature the thermostat should be, much less legislation that comes through. If it takes 100% buy-in to create a prosperity district, how is that threshold ever attained? And if it is attained, who oversees that district?
Well, it would obviously only attain in districts that have very few people, so probably 5-10 people. And if you look in large rural areas, farming areas, it's not unusual to have a square mile or more of land in the hands of 5 or 10 people, right? And so your point is well taken, but this is a feature, not a bug. The goal is to make sure that when you're doing a dramatic policy shift like this, that everyone is truly bought in, and everyone has truly got skin in the game, and no one's being forced. And yes, that means it's going to start relatively small and out of the way, and it's not going to be imposed on everyone, and that's a good thing. In terms of oversight, again, in this district, anything that involves a violation of criminal laws that are evil intent type criminal laws or violence, outside law enforcement jurisdictions have the exact same authority they have now. No different than if it was happening in Oklahoma City, okay? You as a legislature in that exemption side of tailoring, if you feel like there needs to be even more oversight than what exists in the baseline, you can add it back. The challenge you have is you need to create a certain regulatory environment where businesses don't have the agent problem of the matrix that they currently have, where they have literally 15 different agencies they have to be concerned about to do anything. And the more you add back the agents to the district, the more you undermine its purpose, which is to create this leapfrog policy environment. So that's the challenge. And again, that I think goes to prove the validity of the 100% buy-in concept, because using that threshold constantly limits the deployment of this idea to places that are likely to be extremely low density, out of the way, affecting very few people, a perfect place for something like this to unfold. And then if the state wants to pull the plug, doesn't like what's going on, there's ways you could build in those plug pulling options into the legislation.
This will be my final question. I have about 50 more, but for the sake of time. The other thing as you went through your slideshow that struck me was just the complexity of the overall idea, because it is a little bit of a foreign idea in the current regulatory climate. I mean, you talked about resetting the clock, resetting the button, going back to scratch. And again, having been in this position for a while, the more complex something is, the harder it is to, one, enforce, but just simply understand. Not just from a lawmaker's perspective, but from an individual's perspective. And one of my concerns is that we could see a situation where there's a misunderstanding of enforcement inside a district of what the regulations should or shouldn't be. There's disagreement from inside the district to outside the district. You can pick whatever the disagreement could be on. I can see that creating tremendous friction from entities such as the state or even local municipalities that are surrounding the area on what the enforcement should be inside. Do you view this as any kind of concern? Do you think, no, everybody's going to understand what the regulations are and should be? For instance, I mean, can a one individual who has a square mile of property, can they create a prosperity district and then say this is what the regulations are supposed to be, but there is a disagreement from outside?
All great questions. One of the features that I've neglected to highlight sufficiently is that any bordering property owner, as long as he's not in a municipality and the municipality doesn't allow it, but any bordering property owner can automatically join the existing district. So let's say you had, and I'll explain why that's important. So you had that one guy set up his 1 mile prosperity district, and he declares this is King Nick's land. And the regulations that are completely copacetic here are anyone who walks across my boundary, I cut his throat. And I think that that's directly related to my property rights, and I'm the king, so that's the rule. Well, there's a lot of problems with that, including that it would threaten, evil intent criminal law, and outside law enforcement would take a look at Mr. King Nick. But one of the controls on it would be that, let's say it was more subtle than that. Outside property owners, if they liked what they saw in that district, could petition to get in using the same process that formed it, and it's very automatic, straightforward. Within 30 days, they could be in it. And the guy who created the district can't keep them out. So he can't keep this place to himself. And the moment that that happens, the burden of proof on any regulation in that district is on the district. And so if he controlled the district, his burden of proof would be to prove that he met all of the rigorous standards in the regulatory impact statement that is spelled out in the legislation. And attorney's fees are shifted to him if he can't prove it. And anybody challenging the regulation can utilize the current court system that King Nick doesn't control, right? So you have a number of outside mechanisms that keep the process honest. But let me just step back and just emphasize, please read this Walt Disney World short brief, and particularly the back of it where we do the comparison between the Prosperity District language and Walt Disney World's authority. If you think what we have has a potential for abuse or misunderstanding, you ain't seen nothing yet. Because what Walt Disney developed for himself in a 98-page piece of legislation literally gave him the ability to do nuclear power. Okay? It literally. And not only that, but Walt Disney World has the power to use eminent domain on neighboring communities without their consent. It can annex neighboring municipalities. None of these powers are in the district. The district we've designed is very careful that it doesn't affect anyone who doesn't want to be affected, and anyone who does affect can get out easily, right? So all I can say is, well, what kept Walt Disney honest with all this potential power abuse that it had for decades and decades? And that is what keeps most of us honest. I mean, it's society. It's culture, its markets, its incentives. And the incentive, the fundamental incentive here is you have a rural area where most likely this will be because of the 100% consent requirement, right? It'll be a low density area, probably rural. It's going to be a place that's downtrodden, that has no other options, otherwise it may not need this environment. Why would that environment be so necessary? In the way that they're going to draw business is not by acting like idiots and not by starting fights with everyone. It's going to be by having a stable, knowable business environment. And that's exactly the model in Walt Disney World. In Walt Disney World, they have incredible amounts of power to abuse. They haven't abused it. If anything, they've tried to be the sweetest, nicest neighbor there ever was, from what I hear, even denying some of the autonomy that they have when push comes to shove. So I think a similar dynamic would exist in reality. And if it didn't, then we would certainly work with the legislature to provide escape valves or release hatches that would be deemed prudent, where if something went haywire, you pull the plug.
Very good. Thank you. Representative Watson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And you've probably already addressed this in some fashion or some way, but if you could kind of maybe talk a little bit along the lines of how these prosperity areas, maybe not just small cities, maybe a county, however these kind of things tend to grow. How would all this work with, and I'm thinking now of infrastructure, if you have interstate highways, if you have transmission lines that pass over these areas, if you have utilities, distribution, going literally from house to house, that kind of thing, tied to other communities and other cities and all those kinds of things. How do you perceive this would work if you had one area that did that? Would they just cut themselves off from everything? And do we start seeing that? Then it starts having an impact on the whole infrastructure and how we function. That's not always real easy and real clear right now, in terms of what we see. But what role does the prosperities entities play, and how would they get along in that kind of environment with the need, quite frankly, for some kind of infrastructure in this country as a whole? How do they work with that kind of infrastructure?
Yeah, that's an excellent concern, and Byron brought it to our attention early. Keep in mind, the district itself doesn't have eminent domain authority, but we do preserve outside agency and eminent domain authority if the purpose is infrastructure related and the need is to run through the district from point A to point B. So districts can't be formed as sort of a buffer to block outside transmission line or road projects that require eminent domain authority through the district. Now, what we do allow for the district to do is designate corridors, a preferred corridor for that exercise of eminent domain, so that an outside agency doesn't abuse that authority to try to mess with the district and say, we're going to have a road over here, and we're going to run through there, we're going to shut down everything over here with a transmission line. So what I would urge you to do is, next time in town perhaps, or some other time, or even now if you wanted to get down into the legislation, but what the legislation does is it says very clearly that the district itself has no eminent domain authority, that eminent domain authority as a general proposition is precluded except for outside agencies running infrastructure. And then the district can respond to that by designating preferred corridors, and if those preferred corridors are consistent with the goal of the outside agency, then they have to use them. But we think, now is that going to satisfy every outside agency that wants to run every conceivable form of infrastructure? Probably not. But then again, we fall back to the point that in the most place, the way to handle this first and foremost is the 100% consent that puts you out in the middle of nowhere, very few people to start, and in that area, you're probably not going to have an abundance of demand in the near future to build infrastructure every which way, right? And then if you had a concern that these districts had an ability to interfere with desired infrastructure in future locations, the fallback position is to use that tailoring ability to maybe limit the formation of these districts to certain areas of the state where you just don't even see any conceivable way that could happen, right? So I would first look at the language, see if it satisfies you. If it doesn't, then ask yourself, is there a place in the state where you would feel comfortable with districts being formed and not really materially threatening any future conceivable infrastructure project that you think?
You recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So how would, and you know, I can see a transmission, a pipeline, I can see those, that, what if, though, it's a small community, they are part of a distribution system that's part of a utility? I mean, all of a sudden, do they have to now have a whole new relationship with that utility? How would that work? You've got literally lines that run to every business, every home within that city. If it's a gas pipeline, distribution pipeline in terms of poles and electric lines, or sometimes underground, whatever that system may be. How would they respond? How would they work with the state regulatory body? Would you just automatically say, okay, we're a prosperity area and whatever existed previously is gone, and now we're going to start all over again, and we'll do this and this and this and this, and we'll work with you on this basis? How would it work in terms of the practicality of how this works out?
Well, I hate to marginalize the project even more, but keep in mind 100% of property owners really means 100% of property owners, and that means easement holders, it means landholders. So, basically, if you're in a typical location where you have already in place easements for gas lines, easements for utility lines, you're going to have the consent of those easement holders in order to form the district alongside the landowners, 100% of it. And so nothing's going to happen if a deal isn't worked out that satisfies the gas companies, the utility companies, and the pipeline companies in that area. And that's why I say I fear to marginalize myself, because again, that friction would tend to keep pushing and pushing and pushing these districts to be formed in places where there was no easements, where the property ownership was very, very simple, very, very few people holding it, very few entities with an interest at issue, all of which is a good thing to deal with at the front end, the concerns you're expressing, because by the nature of where you can form these districts easily, you're going to be in a place where the complexities that concern you really aren't in play. And if you had those complexities, it'd be a good thing, right? I mean, then you'd have the development that you're hoping for.
You're going to ask for one more follow-up.
I'm not concerned about the ones that are out there in the future. I'm concerned about the ones that are already there, how that would be managed.
Yeah,
I mean, because if you're talking about the future, yeah, fine, all that works out if you're out there in an area where you don't have it. But when you've got an area where you've already got something, and quite frankly, other people who are tied to that distribution system, I'm thinking of a utility, they're also tied into rate base and all that kind of stuff. They're part of a bigger project, statewide, that kind of thing, in terms of territory-wide, whatever it is. That would be my concern in terms of how that would work. The future and how they evolve into a new area, that's not my concern. I would be concerned about how do you manage, how do you work with that, how do you handle that? Would you suddenly come in and say, you can no longer function here because we're a prosperity district, and we'll talk to you as a group. We're going to have a town meeting and have 100 votes here and have everybody show up at a town meeting whether or not we're going to let you be here.
I don't, because of the 100% consent requirement from all property owners, which includes easement holders, in an already developed area that crisscross with easements for all sorts of things, the discussion with the utilities, with the pipeline holders, with anybody who has these interests will happen long before the district is formed. And by the way, I see this as an opportunity, because let's say you're a utility and you want to get out, well, it's less of a threat now with the current administration, but let's say you wanted to get out from under some hardcore new regulations coming from the federal government, but you wanted to preserve certain other regulations. You could work out a deal that you would consent to the formation of this district, and then in those district training wheels, those 5-year training wheels, you might preserve some of the regulations that you prefer in your area, but then you might actually have this district formed for the purpose of challenging that federal law, right? You could override the federal law in the district if we got congressional consent. So all I would say to you is, again, the genius of this plan and this failing and what marginalizes it, because it's not the biggest It's not going to end the world. It's not going to change the world overnight. This is extremely incremental, but in a territorial way, right? But the genius of this plan is if you want to get 100% consent to form this district, you're going to have to sit down with all of these interests and work it out before you form the district, which then leads to the district being formed to serve certain purposes that are going to obviously be a win-win from everyone's perspective. And so think of it this way. The district is and always will be a reset button of some kind. It will be a reset button on regulation of some kind. What its ultimate form looks like really depends on what it takes to get that initial 100% consent buy-in, right? And if that means you have a complicated environment that's going to require a complicated structure to figure this out, that's going to be decided before you ever get to the point of getting formation. And it will be known up front, and that will actually, even in a complex environment, knowing all that up front before you form the district and knowing what the regulatory environment is going to benefit investment.
Representative Moore, you're recognized to ask questions and wrap up the study.
Okay, very good. Hey, so we have like areas like that in the state already, most likely. Do we call the MAPS area, downtown Oklahoma City, where Bricktown was, that's kind of its own prosperity district? OU Health Science area, that community, the Airport Authority, the River Authority, Arkansas River, Oklahoma River, Lake Hefner, Mid-America Industrial Park over in Pryor. Would you say those are somewhat examples of prosperity districts already in place?
I would say that they show what good things can happen when you change policy in a positive way in a small area. The reason why I hesitate, as I am, is that oftentimes these other district concepts involve things more than just reducing the regulatory load or enhancing policy reform. They sometimes involve a subsidy or two, and this doesn't allow that at all.
Yep. But that is a concentrated effort to grow something or, bring economy to, or increase economy to a certain area. So could this help a blighted area that you have in your community?
Amazingly, our strongest advocate in Arizona is the former mayor of South Tucson, which is a poor Hispanic community south of Tucson, and it's about a square mile. We didn't mean that to happen, and he called me out of the blue, and to this day he emails me and Facebooks me, and he's begging for Arizona to get on board with this, to give him this option, because he is the very definition of a blighted community. And he's a blighted community with a population of extremely entrepreneurial people that are held back by occupational regulation, by business regulation, in a significant way. And so, yeah, I think if you're looking at a blighted community, particularly a low-income, relatively unsophisticated business environment, the idea that you could sweep away these incredibly costly, complex occupational business regulations in that environment would be a massive boom.